This is episode 410 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Murat Öğütçü, Assistant Professor Doctor at the Department of Western Languages and Literatures at Muzur University, Turkey, and author of chapters and articles on early modern English drama. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend, Cassidy Cash.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
In The Merry Wives of Windsor, Shakespeare gives us the brisk reminder, better 3 hours too soon than a minute too late. But it raises an irresistible question about how did Shakespeare know whether he was early or late? What kinds of clocks existed in his lifetime? How reliable were they? Who made them? And what technologies allowed early modern people to measure time at all? Today, we're stepping into the world of 16th and 17th century timekeeping, an age of intricate mechanisms, emerging precision, and beautifully crafted instruments that shaped the rhythm of Shakespeare's day. From household clocks to public timekeepers, these early devices offer us a remarkable window into the lived experience of time in the early modern world. To help us explore this history, we're joined by Dr. Jane Desborough, Curator of Scientific Instruments at the Science Museum in London. Dr. Desborough works with one of the most significant collections of surviving early modern clocks, and her research brings together material culture, craftsmanship, and technological innovation to shine a light on how these objects were made and understood. In our conversation today, we'll look at what kinds of clocks Shakespeare might have encountered, how they worked, what accuracy meant before standard time, and how surviving artifacts help us trace the development of timekeeping across the 16th and 17th century. Sit back and get comfy, because we're about to dive into the fascinating world of time technology that shaped Shakespeare's world. Let's get started. Hello, Jane. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Did wristwatches, pocket watches, and other portable timepieces exist for Shakespeare's lifetime?
So there were several kinds of portable timekeeper in Shakespeare's lifetime. You had portable sundials, not mechanical, but they'd been around for several hundred years. But you also had portable spring-driven clocks and pocket watches. And while a form of wristwatch was presented to Queen Elizabeth I, the first wristwatches were not made until the early 19th century and didn't really become widespread until the First World War. But in terms of those pocket watches and the portable clocks, they seem to have originated in the clockmaking centres of southern Germany in the first few decades of the 16th century. Proving popular, both forms of timepiece quickly spread throughout Europe. And it's worth noting that the owners of these kinds of device were very wealthy. We're talking about monarchs, aristocrats, high-ranking clergy, wealthy merchants and lawyers, etc. It wasn't until later that portable timepieces reached the kind of middling parts of society. As we're talking about Shakespeare's lifetime, in 16th century England, clocks and watches were still being imported from Europe or being made by Europeans who'd moved to London. But this eventually spurred on the British trade, and by 1631, they had their own livery company, the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers, which still exists today.
There was a significant reliance on astrology for Shakespeare's lifetime, and I wonder if this belief is reflected in the different attributes that were added to a clock from the 16th century.
Yes, very much so. I'm glad you've asked this. So we see this on dials, which indicated much more than simply the time of the day. There were calendrical indications, such as the day of the week, represented by its planetary symbol, date of the month of the year, and sometimes even the 4 seasons. There were lunar indications, such as the changing phase of the moon, represented pictorially, the lunar calendar 1 to 29.5, where the full moon occurs on the 15th day, and sometimes even tidal indications, though that became a bit more popular later on. And finally, there were astronomical indications such as the zodiac calendar and even astrolabic dials, which indicated the positions of the planets and some of the stars. And all of these indications were variously represented on dials via subsidiary dials and apertures, all using concentric rings. Now, some people assume that these indications were just all about showing off. And while I do accept that they were indeed very beautiful, in this period there was so much more to it than that. And it's only when we compare them with almanacs and similar forms of literature that we can appreciate their use as tools of astrology and organisation. So, for example, in William Johnson's almanac of 1569, there's an item on the page for March which reads, "The full moon eclipsed on Thursday, the 3rd day of this month at 4 of the clock, 46 minutes in the morning, cold, cloudy after snow and foul weather, wind southeast." And it's also accompanied with an image of planting. So here we're getting information about the moon's age and an eclipse, but also a connection with the weather and the priority activity for that month. And later on in the almanac, there's information about the position of the planets and a prognostication concerning sickness for each season. So for spring, it reads, "The sicknesses of this present time will be grievous and many." And it gives examples such as what it calls palsies and black jaundices, going on to say that this will be followed by fevers and running eyes, and concluding that that's quite strange for this time of year. So we can see here what a combination of calendrical, lunar and astronomical information was used for at this time. And having all of this on a clock or watch to be used with an almanac rather than having to keep track of all that manually was clearly very useful. And I should also say that as an instrument, timepieces with multifunction dials such as these that I've been describing also played a symbolic role for their owners, in that by owning them and being seen with them, they were able to demonstrate their status as holders of complete knowledge. So not literally, but as I say, symbolically, given that such a range of information was contained in one device, which automatically adjusted itself day by day as long as it was kept wound up. And then finally, these indications began to wane over time, and they began to disappear from dials as astrology loses its hold. And that decline is also paralleled in almanacs. So there's definitely a connection there.
Obviously, that's a massive amount of information to have on the dial of a clock. And you're mentioning that they were quite elaborate and even beautiful in their presentation. So I wonder what the dial of a clock in Shakespeare's lifetime would have looked like. Maybe a typical one. What would it have included?
Yeah, so we touched on the sort of calendrical, lunar and astronomical indications. As I say, these would have been represented by different subdials, so different circles on that dial. I think it's also interesting to think about how the time of day was represented, because it was a bit different to today. You would have had the hours and the quarters of each hour represented as well. And in England, this was either rendered as 1 to 12 in Roman numerals as one set, or to represent the 24 hours of a day as 2 sets of 1 to 12, whereas in Germany, they represented the 24 hours as 1 to 12, but also then as 13 to 24. So there were regional differences. And it's interesting to think about people thinking of time in terms of the quarters rather than minutes as we do today. And the other thing that you might have seen on a dial was an alarm setting disc, because many had an alarm feature as well. And also in the 16th century, touch pins around the hour so that you could feel the time in the dark, or if you were partially sighted, you could make use of it as well.
That's incredibly practical, and I wouldn't have thought they would have included that on their clocks. How were they made to function? I mean, were they made out of metal and they counted the time using springs? You mentioned a spring-loaded portable clock earlier, or were there other mechanisms that were having it automate the collection of time?
So the mechanism of a mechanical clock or watch is called a movement, and movements in this era contained iron, brass and steel. Dials and casings were made from metal that was often gilded with gold or silver to make them very aesthetically pleasing. But in terms of how a mechanical clock or watch works, and this is true across the board of all different types, there's 5 steps or stages that you need to be aware of, really. Firstly, you need energy to drive it. So this is provided by the spring that has been wound tight. With non-portable clocks that were weight driven, that's achieved through a falling weight, so it does the same job. But the next thing is that stored energy in the spring needs to be transported through the movement. And this is achieved with a series of toothed wheels and pinions known as a gear train. However, a device is needed to prevent that stored energy from the spring just spinning through the wheels really fast and running down too quickly. It needs to measure time. So the third element required is an escapement, so literally preventing energy from escaping. You also need a controller that works with the escapement to regulate the timekeeping and enable the clock or watch to be sped up or slowed down depending on how it's performing. Clocks and watches in Shakespeare's time kept time quite well for the period, but that was to within 15 minutes per day, and over 4 days, it could be an hour out. So, it's important to be able to regulate it. And before the introduction of the pendulum and the balance spring in the mid to late 17th century, this was achieved in clocks and watches by what's known as a weighted balance bar or wheel. And then finally, a dial and hands are needed to indicate the time measured by the controlled release of energy through the gear train. So this is achieved by what's known as motion work, and that's a small set of gears on the underside of the dial. So that's how a clock or watch works. And some people have described them as living things, and I can really see why. They're mechanical marvels, really.
If today's conversation on early modern timekeeping has sparked your curiosity, you can dive even deeper inside that Shakespeare society. I've curated a set of surviving 16th and 17th century clocks, paintings, and primary documents that illuminate how time was marked and measured in Shakespeare's world. Members can explore these artifacts in our research vault and follow the history even further than what we're able to cover right here on the show. You can join us and access this episode's extras at CassidyCash.com/episode 410. Just look for the signal for that Shakespeare society. Was working as a clockmaker considered a high status position due to the intricate and specialized nature of their work? You're mentioning that a lot of clocks were imported. So I think I'm wondering whether there were people in England that were doing this work.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And in the 16th century, the trade was small, but it rapidly grew. So in terms of their status, yes, in the sense that clock and watchmaking was a craft and it was highly technical. Not anyone could do it. Typically, a clock or watchmaker served a 7-year apprenticeship, and then they worked as a journeyman for an established maker before setting up on their own. So it took a long time to set up their own business. It should also be said that clock and watchmakers didn't make every part of a clock or watch from scratch. They subcontracted part making to others and then assembled the final piece. But that said, they did have to know how to make every part and the stages because adjustments were needed and they often undertook repairs and things like that. But to return to your question, also no, in the sense that tradespeople at this time were not highly esteemed in society, or not as much as the gentry or senior clergy and those wealthy merchants or lawyers. In Britain, they occupied what was become known as a sort of middling sort between the high professions and the labouring poor. So it was only from the late 17th century onwards that their status really grew. And it should also be mentioned that many clock and watchmakers went bankrupt because their wealthy clients placed orders with them, but paid much later. And sometimes makers just couldn't make up the shortfall while they waited for payment to come in.
Are there features of a clock in Shakespeare's lifetime that didn't survive to the present day analog clock format?
So calendrical, lunar and astronomical indications gradually disappeared and were all but gone by the 1770s, except for decorative pieces. Quarter-hour indications gave way to the indication of minutes from 1657 in clocks and from 1675 in watches. From that time, seconds were mostly indicated on a subsidiary dial located above the hour numeral 6. From around 1770, there were some examples of the sort of centre seconds, as we call it, what we'd be used to as seconds representation. But this arrangement didn't really take off until the early 20th century. So what we're left with now, both what is there and what's no longer there, but could have been, is a really interesting story. And that's how I first became interested in early modern clock and watch dials. I wanted to know why the modern analog dial looked the way it did and why this was so different to how a lot of dials looked in Shakespeare's lifetime.
So just to clarify, in Shakespeare's lifetime, was the clock oriented with a 12 at the top and a 6 at the bottom?
Yes, on some dials, but on those that indicated or represented a 24-hour day, you may have 12 at the bottom because you've got two sets of 1 to 12 for the 24 hours, if that makes sense.
To take you through midnight into the next the next day. Yes. What is your favorite watch or clock artifact that survives from this time period?
So there's a watch at the British Museum made by Jean-Baptiste Dubourg in Geneva in about 1650. It's known as a coach watch, and it's very large and was intended to be taken with the owner when they travelled. It strikes the hours, it's got an alarm, it indicates the hours, the portion of the day rendered as day and night, the day of the week, date of the month, season of the year, the lunar phase, and the lunar calendar. And just combined with a pocket almanac, this would have been such a remarkable instrument for its travelling owner. And given what I know about the decline of these kinds of indication on dials, this is certainly one of the last of its kind. A really practical, multifunction watch rather than a merely decorative object or demonstration device. So I just love it.
With that much information in one place, you could almost predict the future.
Yeah.
From your work into this topic, if we're new to this branch of history and the idea of exploring what features were in a clock for Shakespeare's lifetime, and we're excited to learn more, what are some additional resources you can recommend for us as a place where we should start if we want to really dive in here?
Yeah, so I'd recommend my book that's called The Changing Face of Early Modern Time, 1550 to 1770, a book called The Clockmakers of London by Sir George White, and then two books by David Thompson, one called Clocks and the other Watches, that's really based on the British Museum's collection, but explores the development of the clock and watch. I'd also recommend visiting the National Museum of wherever the listener lives. They probably have a wonderful collection of clocks and watches to see. And if any listeners are in London, I'd recommend coming to the Science Museum, the V&A, British Museum and the National Maritime Museum. Each one has a magnificent collection which is worth visiting, and you can also explore online, of course.
Always a good idea to go visit a museum. Never a bad suggestion. So we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
It's a wonderful question, and my answer is Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. And I know people are familiar with the musical, but this is my favourite book of all time. Not early modern, but it's a masterpiece of literature, and I'm particularly taken with how the author uses time in his narrative, skillfully taking the reader through different strands and then bringing it all back together at the end. It's so wonderful.
Not only an elegant choice, but definitely on brand for your area of research. I love that selection. Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Yeah, so I'm continuing my research into the history of London. I'm trying to find out more about what the everyday life was for the early modern apprentice, and also about the people that supplied the clockmaking trade. There's always more to discover, so that's why I keep going.
Always more good questions to ask. I love it. I will look forward to seeing what you uncover, and definitely go see the Science Museum next time you're in London. We will place links to all of these resources in the show notes, so stay tuned for the URL for where to find those. Thank you so much, Jane Desborough, for being here today and helping us explore the world of clocks for Shakespeare's lifetime and understand this part of his history that much better. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
All of the resources we've talked about in the show today, including more information about our guests and related podcast episodes, are all listed for you right now at CassidyCash.com/episode 410. While you're there, don't forget to check out That Shakespeare Society for exclusive insider extras related to today's topic. Again, that URL is CassidyCash.com/EP410. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.